the same coin. While Dad was a straight-laced, by-the-book detective with the Santa Monica Police Department, Uncle Ray ran a surf shack right on the beach with his skin Growing up, I thought my Uncle Ray was the coolest guy in the world. He was my dad's younger brother by 4 years, and they were like two sides of the same coin. While Dad was a straight-laced, by-the-book detective with the Santa Monica Police Department, Uncle Ray ran a surf shack right on the beach with his skin tanned from the sun and his hair perpetually smelling of salt and wax. He wasn't a loser by any stretch because that surf shack was a brick-and-mortar business with a half-dozen employees and a six-figure turnover. But to Dad, Ray would always be his wayward kid brother. You could see he loved him to death, but he also looked at him with a kind of protective concern, as if he was still waiting for him to grow up. Ray had a beach house right there on the shore, a place that felt like a permanent vacation. A few times every summer, we'd pack up the car and drive over to hang out with him and his girlfriend, Nina. Those were the golden days. Growing up, I thought my Uncle Ray was the coolest guy in the world. He was my dad's younger brother by 4 years, and they were like two sides of the same coin. While Dad was a straight-laced, by-the-book detective with the Santa Monica Police Department, Uncle Ray ran a surf shack right on the beach with his skin tanned from the sun and his hair perpetually smelling of salt and wax. He wasn't a loser by any stretch because that surf shack was a brick-and-mortar business with a half-dozen employees and a six-figure turnover. But to Dad, Ray would always be his wayward kid brother. You could see he loved him to death, but he also looked at him with a kind of protective concern, as if he was still waiting for him to grow up. Ray had a beach house right there on the shore, a place that felt like a permanent vacation. A few times every summer, we'd pack up the car and drive over to hang out with him and his girlfriend, Nina. Those were the golden days, filled with the sound of waves, the taste of salt water, and the easy laughter of family. But then one summer, everything changed. We were all packed with a car loaded with towels and coolers and ready to head down to the beach when suddenly my dad came out and told us the trip was off. He said Uncle Ray was busy and we'd have to wait for another time. We could still go to the beach, just not to Ray's. I remember the sting of disappointment, but I was only 7, and the second my toes hit the sand, the feeling was forgotten and washed away by the tide. Back then, I was still wrapped in the innocence of childhood, so the sudden change of plans didn't strike me as suspicious at all. But looking back, I can see the shift. I noticed how different Mom and Dad were acting, and how they'd talk in hushed, urgent tones whenever they thought my brother and I were out of earshot, busy playing in the sand. I didn't question it because I was too absorbed in building sandcastles and dodging waves. The next day, the world tilted on its axis. Mom and Dad sat me and my little brother down on the living room couch with their faces grim and told us that Uncle Ray had been in a car accident. They said he had gone to heaven. I won't tug on your heartstrings with all the details, but losing Uncle Ray left a hole in my world for a long, long time. The grief was a heavy blanket, but as it always does, time began to heal the wound. The sharp pain dulled to a faint ache, and life, as it must, went on. I grew up, graduated, got a job, and eventually found myself living up in Oxnard with a girl I'd been dating for a few years. One evening, we drove back down to Santa Monica to visit my parents. We had a nice dinner, and then we were on our way back up the Pacific Coast Highway to Oxnard. As we drove, my girlfriend got very quiet, a mopey sort of silence filling the car. I asked if she was okay. She said yeah, her voice soft, but that she just gets a little weirded out sometimes whenever she's near this part of the PCH. I asked why, and this is what she told me. 20 years before, her mom's old high school friend went to stay in a log cabin with her boyfriend of many years. She told my girlfriend's mom everything about the trip, including where it was, how long she was going for, and when she was expected to return. So when that day came and went with no sign of her friend, my girlfriend's mom started to get worried. And she wasn't the only one. The girl's parents called the cops, told them where their daughter had been and who she was with, and asked them to go looking for her. A few days later, they got the worst news imaginable. A car belonging to their daughter's boyfriend had been found, deliberately driven off the road. He was inside, dead from a broken neck, and she was in the trunk, cut up and wrapped in plastic. The cops never figured out how or why the girl had been killed or why her boyfriend had driven his car off the road, but his prints were all over the plastic wrap. So the conclusion seemed obvious. My girlfriend said her mom took the news really hard. She'd met the guy a bunch of times and said he seemed like a really sweet dude. She used to get emotional sometimes while driving down that spot on the highway too, and I guess being where it happened was just a little too much for her. I'm listening to this story and saying things like, "Damn, that's terrible." Then my girlfriend said the girl's name almost as an afterthought. "Poor Nina," she sighed. "Hell of a way to go." I think I must have driven for a full minute in silence before the name registered and clicked into place with a horrifying jolt. "Wait a second," I said, my voice tight. "Did you just say Nina?" When my girlfriend confirmed, Two thoughts flashed through my head with the force of a lightning strike. The first was the memory of Uncle Ray having a girlfriend named Nina, and the second was remembering how he died in a car accident when no one had ever said anything about it being on purpose. "Do you remember the name of the boyfriend?" I asked, a panicked feeling rising in my chest. "The one that had driven off the road?" The only thing that kept me from losing it was a small, rational voice in my head, whispering that it's just a coincidence, that this is pattern recognition gone wrong, that there are plenty of Ninas in the world, and I'm freaking out over nothing. But as soon as my girlfriend spoke next, that reassuring voice got up and walked out like a rock star at a bad interview. "I think it was like Ron or Rick or something," she said. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Was it Ray?" She spun around in her seat, her eyes wide. Yeah, it was Ray. Did you hear about this already?" I didn't say anything because I couldn't. I realized I had to concentrate on the road instead of the chaos unfolding in my head. At the next chance I got, I pulled over to the side of the road with the gravel crunching under the tires. I asked my girlfriend to wait in the car, then got out and called my parents. It was almost 9 by then. Mom was in bed, but Dad was still up watching TV, and it was him that answered. He could tell something was wrong just from the tremor in my voice. As I was asking if Mom was asleep, he interrupted me. "Just tell me what's going on," he said, his tone serious. I remember pausing to gather my thoughts and trying to form the question. Finally, I just asked him, "Dad, how did Uncle Ray die?" He said, his voice cautious, "You know how. It was a car accident." I pressed, "But was it just an accident, or did something else happen?" It was his turn to pause. I could almost hear him gathering his own thoughts and weighing his words. And then all he said was, "Come by the house tomorrow. I'll explain everything." Getting back into the car, I felt weirdly numb. Although my girlfriend basically demanded to know what was going on, I couldn't find the words to tell her until we were back home, safely off the road. I had this irrational fear that unless I kept myself together, I'd end up dying in a car accident too, like some inescapable loop from an overcomplicated horror movie. But obviously, that didn't happen. We got home safe. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, and then my girlfriend and I had a teary heart-to-heart where I explained everything, including the part where my dad had all but confirmed my fears with that "I'll explain everything" line. She kept saying she was sorry, like it was her fault for telling me, but it wasn't her fault. It was Ray's. I could barely sleep that night. When I did manage to drift off, I had this ultra-vivid nightmare where my dad took me into the garage and showed me Ray's body. I woke up just before he opened the coffin, but it was enough to have me splashing my face with cold water in the bathroom sink, waiting for the shakes to subside. A few hours later, I was back on the highway, driving down to Santa Monica to talk to my parents. I expected things to get ugly, emotionally speaking, and boy, did they ever. Mom was already crying when I got there. The first thing she did was give me a big hug and tell me she was sorry they never told me the truth. Obviously, I already had an idea of what that truth was, but hearing all the details was still one of the most chilling and disturbing experiences of my entire life. Dad said all the same stuff my girlfriend had, that Ray and Nina had gone to some log cabin for the weekend, and he was supposed to return on Monday morning. But then, Monday afternoon, he called Dad from a road. Dad said he sounded mad, that he was ranting and raving about something, but nothing he said made any sense. He mentioned that something had happened at the cabin, but Dad couldn't get any details out of him before Ray just hung up. Dad said he figured he'd called from the road because he could hear traffic in the background. Later on, he tried calling Ray at home, but he didn't pick up. He called him the next morning too, but still got no answer. That was the same day that we were supposed to head over to Ray's. Then, literally a half hour before we were set to leave, Dad spotted a car out front. He walked outside, and it was 2 detectives from the local police department who were guys he knew personally. That's when they told him that Ray had been found and that it wasn't good news. Dad didn't work homicide, and even if he did, there's no way he'd have been on that case. But he still got all the info from his fellow detectives, and it was all those extra details that changed the whole thing from something they might talk to me about someday to something they'd never willingly bring up at all. The first thing that really got Dad's attention was when the homicide detectives traced Ray's movements to the cabin he and Nina had been staying in. It was up near Redwood Deck, part of a collection of 5 whose rental costs made their owners a lot of money. The cabins were in a nice, sleepy patch of redwoods up near the falls, but they were never quiet. Apart from a couple of weeks during the June gloom, the cabins were fully booked almost all year round. But during the weekend Ray and Nina were staying there, a weekend in September, all 4 of the other cabins were empty. The detectives found out when they tried to find witnesses, people who could testify to Ray's behavior or state of mind around the time of Nina's murder. They'd heard about how popular the cabins were, so imagine their surprise when they found no bookings at any of the others. They hadn't been closed for the weekend or reserved. There were just no bookings. None, except for Nina and Uncle Ray. This led the homicide detectives to question the owners of the cabins extensively, but there was no indication they were involved. The next thing that didn't add up was how, on the day Ray and Nina were due to drive back to Santa Monica, they'd stopped at a gas station just hours before Ray called my dad, ranting and raving. The clerk remembered them acting perfectly normal. Ray pumped some gas, Nina bought a soda, and then they left together like nothing whatsoever was wrong. But then, somehow, in some place over the next 20 miles or so, Ray pulled over, chopped Nina into little bits, wrapped her in plastic, and threw her in the trunk of his car. The detectives couldn't work out if Ray murdered Nina before or after that creepy phone call he made to my dad, but they knew that not long after the call was made, he went and drove himself off the road after unfastening his seatbelt. Or, at least, that's what appeared to have happened, according to the scene. I remember my dad telling me all this with Mom sitting next to him, holding his hand. He was always a really strong, stern kind of guy, but telling me that story was the only time I ever saw him well up with tears. It wasn't just the sadness of it all. It was the frustration of not knowing why and of having all those unanswered questions about the cabins, Ray's state of mind, and what he'd said during that phone call. Because the phone call he made on the day of the murder was something that scared the crap out of my dad. Obviously, once they learned about the call, the detectives wanted to know what Ray had said, but all Dad had to tell them was nothing. They asked him to clarify, and my dad told them pretty much what he told me. It was just words, Dad said, his voice cracking. Not a single thing that he said made any sense. It was all just random words. He said he concentrated as best he could, trying to work out what Ray was saying. But then he got this weird, sinking feeling when he realized Ray had just gone nuts. He kept telling Ray to calm down and that he'd call him at home in a couple of hours to see if he was okay. But he never picked up, and that was the start of everything. By the time Dad had finished, I just felt kind of numb. I'd rolled a few tears when my mom and dad cried, but that was just because of seeing how upset they were. I felt numb because I'd been thinking about it throughout the whole sleepless night prior. For maybe 15 hours straight, I questioned it, accepted it, and then questioned it some more before accepting it all over again. So when the time came to hear all the gruesome, gritty details, I was just sort of resigned to it all. Mom and Dad kept apologizing for keeping the truth from me for so long, and in a more general sense, that things had to happen that way in the first place. I reassured them in every sense possible, saying I understood why they did what they did. Because how the hell could you ever expect a younger person to process something like that? But that didn't seem to do much for them. I guess it was all that emotion spilling out after years and years of pretending everything was okay and of not being able to talk about it openly. We were all emotionally wrecked by the time it came for me to drive back. When I got home, I told my girlfriend how it had been my uncle who'd most likely murdered her mom's high school friend. As you can imagine, that made for quite the talk. And we talked about it a lot. I guess that's the thing that helped me more than anything, all the free therapy I got from being with someone who genuinely gave a damn about me. So much so that she never told her mom what she knew, at least not while we were together. Over time, we just sort of moved past it. We broke up a few years later for totally unrelated reasons, but I think about her a lot still. I think about how she helped me get past one of the single worst events of my entire adult and child life. I grew up in Greater Manchester in a single-parent family, and since it had always been just me and my mom, I never knew any different. Although I sometimes got a bit sad that other girls had dads at home, I loved my mom more than anything and was grateful for her. As I got older, Mom told me things about my dad, like what he was like, what he enjoyed, and eventually how he died. I was still very young when she told me, so she had to explain that Daddy and his friends were in a sailboat on the sea when a big wave knocked them off the boat. She said they went underwater, and that's when the angels came down and took them to heaven because it's nicer there than on the bottom of the sea. It might sound a bit grim, but years later while watching SpongeBob, I used to think the sea didn't look all that bad and that heaven must be brilliant. Kids just say and think the funniest things, with heavy sarcasm implied there. So that's basically how I grew up, and because Mom told me early enough, I got used to it, and it never filled me with angst or became the source of too much sadness. But then came the day Mom told me the truth, and that changed everything. As I've mentioned, Mom only ever told me the good things about Dad, like how he loved football, a good Indian takeaway, and had worked for a building firm since leaving school at 16. He sounded like a nice guy who always looked after Mom and never hit or cheated on her. But when she was pregnant with me, he went on a lad's holiday to Spain to enjoy the last of his freedom before I was born and took a fateful boating trip where he went a little too far out to sea. The weather took a turn, and that was that. Only that wasn't that, because Mom only ever told me half the story. I was 23 and over at my mom's for a cup of tea when she asked the question that kicked it all off. And I think I knew something bad was coming when she asked out of the blue if I would want to know things about my dad that she'd never told me. I asked what kind of things she was talking about, immediately suspecting from her tone that it was less than wholesome stuff. And she told me Dad sometimes did things she didn't approve of. She had been wondering if I wanted to know only the good parts or the whole truth about who he really was as a man, adding that she wouldn't think any less of me if I said no. But the offer was on the table. Of course I said yes because I wanted to know the full picture, as people are complicated and sometimes good people make bad decisions. I don't believe that some truths are better off buried, so I'm glad she told me the truth for the most part, but I could never have been ready for what she was about to say. So I wasn't exactly a planned pregnancy, but since Mom and Dad loved each other, wanted kids, and were happy in their relationship, it was basically inevitable. When Mom gave Dad the news that she'd missed her period, it hit him quite hard, not in a bad way, because she says he was happy and excited. But he definitely had a moment of realizing he needed to get his life together. Mom said he wasn't the best at work, just a good lad, but not someone you'd consider for a promotion. So it looked like it would be a while before he earned any serious money. He got his head down and worked really hard, but you could tell he was getting frustrated because he knew it would be a hard road. Then one day he came home from football with a spring in his step, and when Mom asked what schemes he had going, he just said, "Never you mind." She said he acted like that for weeks, like he was the cock of the walk and the smartest man in England. Then one day that man disappeared. Not literally, as that came later, but the cheerful, happy-go-lucky version of Dad vanished. Mom said he acted like something terrible had happened, with a level of grief where she'd catch him staring into space with wide, scared eyes as if something terrible was following him. When she asked what was wrong, he would lie and say everything was fine even though it blatantly was not. He stayed like that for about a week without improving, and then out of the blue told Mom he and his mate were going to Spain for that lad's holiday to enjoy the last of his freedom. Mom was surprised but thought she understood his thought process, figuring he was mega stressed about me being on the way and needed time to relax. So she let him go, and he flew to Spain with his friend. He was only supposed to be gone a week, but when a week went by and he didn't come home, Mom started to worry and got in touch with the police. After she told them where Dad had gone, they contacted the Spanish police, who started looking for him, but found he wasn't at any of the places he'd mentioned. While there was evidence of him entering the country on his passport, there was no evidence he'd left, which narrowed things down. They started checking local hospitals and jails just in case something had happened, but they didn't find Dad anywhere. Mom said she had to wait another week or so before she got the devastating news that a boat had washed up on a beach in southern Spain containing half a dozen empty sports bags and the bodies of 2 dead Englishmen, my dad and his friend. Mom said 2 police liaison officers, the kind who deliver bad news, came to talk to her. They explained that Dad and his friend had been shot at close range on a rented motorboat, which then drifted for some days before washing up on the beach. Neither the English nor Spanish police knew exactly why they had been murdered, but they reckoned it was probably related to the cocaine residue found in the empty sports bags. Mom was stunned because it was so unlike Dad to be involved with drugs, and she realized the cocaine must have been the thing he was so excited about that he thought would make him a load of money. It was a lot to handle, and just when Mom thought things couldn't get any worse, they did, getting much worse over the next couple of weeks. About a week after the liaison officers visited, they called Mom back with unwelcome news that the Greater Manchester Police had a warrant to search our house because they suspected Dad was involved in a murder that happened before he was killed. Mom said the stress was so bad she thought she might miscarry, and it was awful for her having policemen searching every nook and cranny of the house. It took ages before the police could tell her what was going on, and when they did, it was even worse than she could have imagined. Around the time Mom found out she was pregnant with me, Dad went into overdrive trying to bring in more money, looking into all sorts of legal things. Then he met a guy in a kebab house named Muzzy, short for Mustafa, who had moved from Turkey to Manchester years before, but was an active figure in the local Turkish community and kept in contact with relatives back home. Dad used to stop by Muzzy's kebab shop after football, and being a friendly guy, especially after a few pints, they used to talk a lot. Dad must have mentioned Mom being pregnant and needing money, because Muzzy told him that for 10 grand in cash, he could turn it into £250,000 in just over a month. We know all this because Dad texted his mate who was killed with him, and the Spanish police recovered the phone from the body and got access to the messages. Dad texted his mate asking if he had 5 grand to go halves on Muzzy's investment plan, but his mate was mega skeptical. Like Dad, he needed time to get the cash and wanted to meet Muzzy to discuss it first. But after they met to talk it out, it was full steam ahead. Apparently, Muzzy had friends in the Turkish mafia who smuggled illegal stuff into the UK, and since border authorities were focused on bigger ports, it was easier to smuggle smaller shipments of things like cannabis resin through smaller ports. The 10 grand would buy a sizable, but not easily detectable amount of product that would fetch 20 times that amount when sold to street dealers. Muzzy wanted a 50 grand handler's fee from the sales, leaving my dad and his mate with £100,000 each, which was a life-changing amount of money at the time. So Dad and his mate got the money to Muzzy, who got it to his friends in the Turkish mafia. And then everyone had to wait. As 1 week, then 2 went by, Dad and his mate got more and more excited until one day Muzzy called with bad news that their shipment was gone. He didn't give much detail, just that the ship came in, the cargo was unloaded, and then police swarmed the container and seized the product. There was nothing to be done because the money was gone. Neither my dad nor his mate believed a word of it, because Muzzy had been saying for months it was a sure thing, and that his mafia friends had been smuggling millions of pounds worth of cannabis resin without a sniff from the police. Then, the one time it was their money on the line, the shipment gets jumped on. According to the text messages, Dad asked Muzzy for proof the shipment was seized. They couldn't just call and ask about the container, but they could call the police to ask if a specific person had been arrested, since that information has to be shared with families or reporters. Dad asked Muzzy who brought the container in and if they were arrested, but Muzzy claimed not to know any names besides his mafia friends, which he wouldn't give up. He said they could try again if they fronted another 10 grand, but otherwise they were out of luck. Personally, I think it was the last bit that drove Dad around the bend because he was convinced Muzzy had robbed him, and the offer of a second chance felt like Muzzy thought he was stupid enough to be milked for another 10 grand. He and his friend were furious, so they hatched a plan to get their money back from Muzzy. Unfortunately, it wasn't a sophisticated plan, as it just involved tying Muzzy up in a shed and torturing him until he confessed. They told Muzzy they were up for another shipment, double this time to recoup their losses. And when Muzzy agreed to meet them to pick up the cash, that's where Dad snatched him. He and his mate tortured Muzzy with cigarette lighters, burning his bound hands and feet, but Muzzy wouldn't confess. They kept beating and burning him, and while he gave them his bank details to take whatever money was in his account, he still wouldn't confess to scamming them. The police don't know exactly what happened next, but Dad didn't take any money, and Muzzy's body was found a few weeks later. We think Muzzy died during the torture, and Dad was forced to dispose of the body, which is why they didn't touch his bank account, as emptying it would point suspicion at them if the body was found. After that, Dad and his friend made the drastic decision to fly to southern Spain to buy cocaine smuggled from Colombia, then take a train through Madrid, Barcelona, and Paris to get a ferry from Dover to Calais, avoiding stricter airline security. I don't know how solid that plan was, but it obviously didn't work out because after meeting someone at sea on a rented motorboat, he and his friend were either double-crossed on the spot or had their cocaine stolen on their way back to land. The empty bags with cocaine residue make me think they were intercepted, because if the sellers wanted them dead, it doesn't add up that they would toss empty bags into the boat. I think they were found by someone else, either someone who preys on small boats doing dodgy deals in the Straits of Gibraltar, or someone they had really pissed off, like the Turks. You see, Muzzy was innocent, as the police confirmed a cannabis shipment had been seized at Falmouth Harbor. So he wasn't lying, and my dad had tortured him for nothing. I just pictured the Turkish gangsters, already annoyed their shipment was seized, then finding out one of their associates was kidnapped and tortured. You wouldn't care if his death was accidental. You just want the people responsible dead. No one knows exactly how they tracked my dad and his mate down, but I suppose when two English guys are wandering around southern Spain asking to buy cocaine, it doesn't take long for word to reach the wrong ears. I wrestled with the truth for a while afterwards because hearing all that obviously changed how I thought about my dad. I don't hate him and I still love him even though I never met him, but I do think he was stupid. I know he did what he did out of love for me and my mom, and a small part of me loves and respects him for that, but a much bigger part of me wishes he'd stuck to something safer and more legal, because if he had, I'd still have a dad. In the quiet Austrian town of Amstetten stands a peculiarly designed building that appears to be two entities fused into one, a regular family home and a more modern apartment building attached to it. For its owner, a retired electrical engineer named Joseph Fritzl, this structure was his life's work and held a secret of unimaginable darkness. He constructed the apartment building in 1978, adding a rooftop garden for tenants who described him as reserved and polite, but also exceptionally strict. He enforced many rules, the most absolute of which forbade anyone from ever entering the building's basement, where he was hiding a secret that would one day horrify the world. Joseph Fritzl was born in Amstetten on April 9, 1935, and his early life was marked by loss after his father abandoned the family when he was 4. 5 years later, his older brother was killed in World War II, leaving his mother Maria to raise him alone, a woman he would later claim was harsh and abusive. At 18, Joseph enrolled in the HTL Technical College and graduated in 1956 with an electrical engineering degree, around which time he married a 17-year-old girl named Rosemary. Their family eventually grew to include 7 children, including their daughter Elizabeth, born on April 6, 1966. Just 1 year after his daughter's birth, Fritzl's behavior took a sinister turn when in 1967 he stalked a 24-year-old nurse in Linz, eventually breaking into her home while her husband was away, holding a knife to her throat, and violating her. Around the same time, Fritzl was a suspect in another assault and a case of indecent exposure, leading to his arrest and trial where an Austrian judge sentenced him to a mere 18 months in prison, of which he only served 12. Following his release, Fritzl worked for a construction firm and as a traveling salesman, but the brief prison sentence did nothing to reform him. In 1977, he began to physically abuse his own 11-year-old daughter Elizabeth, a torment that continued for 6 long years. After completing her compulsory education at 16, Elizabeth enrolled in a vocational course that required more freedom, which she seized by fleeing to Vienna with a friend. Since she was a minor, police tracked her down and returned her to her family, after which her father supposedly became more lenient to prevent another escape, but this was a cunning ploy. By the summer of 1984, an 18-year-old Elizabeth had completed her course and was offered a job near Linz, and Fritzl knew he was about to lose his victim. He began working on a plan, undertaking a project in the basement so common that Elizabeth never suspected his monstrous intentions. On August 28, 1984, Fritzl asked for her help carrying a heavy door down into the basement. Elizabeth obliged her father and helped him carry the door into a small, windowless room that looked like a makeshift prison cell, causing a wave of panic to wash over her. When she asked to leave, her father clamped an ether-soaked towel over her face and sealed her inside her new prison with the very door she had just carried. After Rosemary Fritzl filed a missing persons report, detectives investigated, but a month later Fritzl presented them with a letter from Elizabeth. The letter was postmarked from a nearby town and confirmed to be in her handwriting, explaining she was tired of her family and would flee the country if they tried to find her. Fritzl told police he believed his daughter had joined a cult, but he had actually forced her to write the letter while chained in his basement. For the next 2 decades, Fritzl entered the basement almost daily to supply his daughter with food and essentials while repeatedly violating her. Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children during her 24 years of captivity, though one baby died shortly after birth. 3 of the children, Lisa, Monica, and Alexander, were brought upstairs to live with Fritzl and his wife, a move made possible because his prior conviction had been expunged. Fritzl told authorities that Elizabeth, whom they believed was an occult, did not wish to raise her children. Child Protective Services sent social workers several times to ensure Fritzl and Rosemary were fit parents, but none saw anything suspicious, and the visits eventually ceased. Meanwhile, the other 3 children, Kirsten, Stefan, and Felix, remained in the cellar with Elizabeth, and in 1994 Fritzl decided to enlarge their prison. He forced his 28-year-old daughter and their children to dig out soil with their bare hands to add over 200 square feet, reportedly incentivizing their labor with a CD player and a television. Fritzl installed a refrigerator and a hot plate and charged Elizabeth with the children's education, punishing failures by shutting off their power or withholding food. When Elizabeth threatened to escape, Fritzl threatened to flood the basement with carbon monoxide and also falsely claimed to have electrified the cell door, terrifying her and the children into compliance. To the world upstairs, Fritzl maintained his charade by telling his wife and tenants the basement was his secret office for designing devices for major companies. He created a fake workshop and concealed the entrance to Elizabeth's prison behind 8 electronically locked doors that only he could open remotely. This security gave him peace of mind despite close calls, like when a tenant heard noises and Fritzl claimed he was fixing faulty pipes. For 24 years, he kept his second family a secret, and his security measures made him believe his scheme would never come to light until one day something changed everything. On the morning of April 19, 2008, Fritzl found his eldest daughter with Elizabeth, Kirsten, was severely ill, and Elizabeth begged him to take her to a hospital. He agreed, and Elizabeth helped carry Kirsten upstairs, where the young woman saw the outside world for the first time before an ambulance took her away and Elizabeth was forced back into the cell. At the hospital, doctors discovered Kirsten had a life-threatening kidney infection and noticed glaring inconsistencies in Fritzl's story, as he didn't seem to know how many children he had and presented a note from Elizabeth after claiming to have severed all contact. After police were alerted, they broadcast a public appeal for information about Elizabeth's whereabouts on April 21st, to which Fritzl again asserted she had joined a specific cult, but an occult expert contacted by police had no knowledge of such an organization. As police reopened the investigation, Fritzl returned to the basement where Elizabeth, convinced Kirsten would die, demanded to be at her child's bedside. It's believed that after a vicious exchange, Fritzl made a fatal error and finally released Elizabeth and their 2 sons, Stefan and Felix, on April 26, 2008. He brought them upstairs to join the family, and Elizabeth went straight to the hospital with Fritzl following to contain the situation. Once there, a tip from suspicious doctors led police to detain both Fritzl and his daughter for questioning. At the police station, Elizabeth agreed to cooperate only on the condition that she would never see her father again, and then she began to tell the story of her 24 years in captivity, revealing horrific details, including how her father would violate her in front of their children after forcing them all to watch adult films. Fritzl was swiftly arrested, and the next night investigators gained access to the underground prison, gazing in horror at its crude sophistication. 2 days later, DNA evidence confirmed Fritzl was the biological father of all of Elizabeth's children, while her mother Rosemary claimed to have no knowledge of the kidnapping. Prior to his trial, Fritzl claimed every interaction with his daughter was consensual despite admitting he knew it was wrong, writing to his lawyer that it became a normal occurrence to lead a second life in his basement. He tried to paint himself as a caring father who was not the beast the media portrayed, explaining he brought Elizabeth flowers and the children books and toys. When asked why he imprisoned her, he was chillingly frank, stating she did not adhere to any rules, so he had to create a place where he could keep her by force. Investigators believed Fritzl's relationship with his own mother was key to his pathology. He spoke of her at length, calling her the best woman in the world, but also admitting she used to beat him until he was lying in a pool of blood on the floor. He explained the humiliation left him feeling weak and that he never had a kiss from her, wanting her to be good to him, but she instead called him a demon, a criminal, and a no good. A final horrifying revelation showed that in 1959 his mother moved in with him and Rosemary, and after initially playing the dutiful son, he began a slow, terrible revenge. He fed her less and allowed her less sunlight until she was too weak to move, at which point he bricked up her window, told neighbors she had passed away, and then gleefully informed his mother the world thought she was dead. She was his first prisoner and remained captive in the attic for up to 12 years until her death in 1980. A forensic psychiatrist diagnosed Fritzl with a severe combined personality disorder, though Fritzl himself believed he was born bad, claiming the plan to imprison Elizabeth came to him in prison back in 1967 as a way of containing his evil side. He chillingly stated he was born to hurt women and could have behaved much worse than just locking up his own daughter. On March 19, 2009, after a harrowing 4-day trial, Fritzl pleaded guilty to murder by negligence for his infant son's death, enslavement, incest, violation, coercion, and false imprisonment, and was sentenced to life in prison. Recently, in a move that has sparked outrage, an Austrian court ruled that the now 89-year-old Fritzl can be moved from a high-security psychiatric unit to a regular prison. The court stated that due to progressive dementia and physical frailty, he is no longer likely to commit a criminal offense with serious consequences. This leaves a haunting question hanging in the air about whether a man like Joseph Fritzl can truly be anything other than a clear and present danger, or if monsters who walk among us will always pose an imminent and irredeemable threat to the most vulnerable in society.
"3 months is an eternity when you're unemployed, a slow-motion burial watching the world you knew crumble into dust one unpaid bill at a time. For me, that dust was a thick gray film settling on a stack of unopened envelopes on my kitchen table in Tacoma, each one a paper-thin monument to my cascading failures. My mother's medical expenses were a methodical predator because diabetes doesn't wait for a paycheck and hospitals are even less forgiving, their demands as cold and unyielding as a morgue slab. The job posting for the MV Leviathan wasn't just a lifeline but a glaring impossible miracle, offering $4,200 per month plus overtime for an experienced cargo handler on Pacific, Northwest to Alaska routes. It was double the going rate, a salary that reeked of desperation, and while a sane man would have asked why, I didn't, because a drowning man doesn't question the rope. He just clings to it. Seattle's Port Terminal 18 at dawn was a study in monochrome, a world painted in shades of gray and smelling of diesel, brine, and the ghosts of dead fish. At 6 a.m. sharp, the Leviathan was a hulking black silhouette against a bruised and swollen sky where rust bled from her hull in long weeping streaks like old wounds that refused to heal. She was a behemoth, 400 feet of weathered steel and faded paint with cargo cranes that groaned in the wind like the arthritic bones of some ancient forgotten beast in a lonely and profound lament for things long lost. "You, Rivera?" The voice was gravel and rust cutting through the damp air from directly behind me, a voice that had swallowed fog and spat out nails. I turned, and the man was a perfect match for the voice, in his 50s with a face like a topographical map of hard miles carved by decades of salt and wind. Captain William Harrison. His eyes were the color of a winter sea, a flat steel blue that seemed to catch the light all wrong like fractured mirrors, and his handshake was a vice, A crushing grip that spoke of raw physical power, but his skin was unnervingly cold, a deep cellular chill that seeped right through my work gloves and into my bones. "That's me, Captain," I said, forcing a confidence I was far from feeling, ready to work. Harrison's broken mirror eyes raked over me in a long clinical assessment that stripped me bare. "Desperate men are the best workers," he stated as a fact, not an opinion. Terrible judgment, though. "You sure you want this job, son?" I forced a laugh that came out brittle and hollow. "Bills don't pay themselves and my mother is sick. I need the money." A flicker of dark satisfaction danced in the depths of his strange eyes. "A family man. I can respect that." He gestured with his chin toward the gangway, a rusted metal tongue lolling from the ship's maw. "Come aboard. Meet what's left of the crew." The deck was slick with morning dew and something else, a faint tacky, almost organic residue that made my boots stick with each hesitant step. Harrison introduced me to David Chen, the ship's engineer, a man in his mid-30s with hands stained a permanent deep black from engine grease, the lines on his palms like intricate tattoos of his trade. He seemed normal enough, a quiet professional, until you looked into his eyes. They weren't just tired, they were ancient and hollowed out, the kind of soul-deep weariness you see in photographs from old wars, the look of a man who has seen too much and slept too little. "David's been with us 3 years, Harrison said with a tone implying this was a monumental achievement, knows the ship better than I do. I asked, 3 years on the same route, and David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Time flies when you're having fun," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any fun at all. The deckhand, James Rodriguez, was my age but looked a decade older, as if the sea had sandblasted the youth from his face. His skin was withered leather and his arms were thick as mooring ropes from a lifetime of hauling. He was coiling a line with a slow methodical rhythm and barely looked up when we approached. "James," Harrison's voice cracked like a whip, "our new crew member." James raised his and I saw the same hollowed-out haunted exhaustion I'd seen in David's eyes, the eyes of men on a death march. "Welcome aboard, hermano," he said, his Spanish and echo-worn smooth of all meaning. "Hope you like the sea." The way he said it sent a cold knot tightening in my stomach, but for $4,000 a month I'd work with a crew of zombies because I had no choice. Harrison's cabin was a cramped, suffocating space that smelled of stale coffee, damp wool, and something medicinal and sweet like formaldehyde. Charts covered every inch of the walls, routes through the Pacific Northwest marked with dates and notations in a dozen different spidery handwritings, some smudged, others crossed out with violent, angry strokes. An old ship's logbook lay open on his desk with pages yellowed and brittle with age. "Coffee?" Harrison poured 2 mugs from a pot that looked like a relic from another century. "Thanks," I said, but when I took a sip my throat seized from a liquid as bitter and corrosive as battery acid. "Now, Rivera," he began, leaning back in his chair, "this isn't the docks. The sea has her own ancient rules and this ship has a few extra." He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a single laminated sheet of paper with 7 rules typed in a stark career font. "Read them, memorize them, obey them," he said, his voice dropping to a low serious growl. "Exactly." I took the sheet, its plastic worn smooth from the touch of countless hands, and my own coffee grew cold as I read. 1. Never throw anything overboard between sunset and sunrise. 2. Avoid the main deck from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. during fog. 3. Ignore any voice you recognize calling your name from the water. 4. Always verify a crew member casts a shadow before you respond to them. 5. During a power outage, find Captain Harrison within 15 minutes or barricade yourself in your cabin. 6. If the ship's horn sounds 3 times without orders, go below deck immediately and do not look out. 7. Never acknowledge the pale figures that stand at the bow during a storm. What the hell is this? I looked up with a nervous, incredulous laugh. This reads like something out of a pulp horror novel. Harrison's smile was a razor slash in his withered face. These aren't suggestions, Rivera, they are the terms of your survival. Survival from what? I asked. From making the same mistakes as the men who came before you, he said, gesturing to the open logbook. 23 men have worked this route in the last 5 years and only David and James have stayed the full term. My eyes drifted to the logbook where the entries were erratic and nonsensical with gaps of weeks or months separating them. I saw an entry for Rodriguez, J, starting work 6 months ago, and another for Chen, D, from 3 years back, but other names were ghosts, appearing for a single hopeful entry and then vanishing without explanation. What happened to the others? I asked in a whisper. Rule breakers, Harrison said, his voice as cold and deep as the bottom of the ocean. The sea doesn't forgive mistakes, and neither does the ship. The cold dread seeped into my bones. Number 4 snagged in my mind like a fishhook. Always verify a crew member casts a shadow. What in God's name did that mean? Look, Captain, I need this job, but these rules are insane. They are the only thing keeping you alive out here. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intense conspiratorial whisper. You think I make these up for fun? This ship has been running these waters for decades, and we've learned what works, what keeps the sea from claiming what is ours. The way he said we made my skin crawl as if he were speaking for more than just the living. My mother's face flashed in my mind, pale and worried, and the stack of bills on my table was a monument to my inadequacy. My gut screamed at me to run, to get off this floating tomb and never look back, but my desperation was a stronger, more insistent voice. I'll follow your rules, I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Good man. Harrison stood and extended his hand to seal the deal. Welcome to the Leviathan. His handshake was just as cold as the first time. The next 2 days were a blur of hard, mind-numbing labor as we loaded containers bound for Juneau. I worked alongside David and James, learning the ship's rhythms, the groans and sighs of its ancient machinery. The work was a familiar ache in my muscles, but the crew was a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. David spoke only in the precise, sterile language of engine maintenance, a professional wall I couldn't breach, while James handled the deck work with a grim, practiced ease. But I'd catch him staring out at the gray churning water with his eyes scanning the waves for something I couldn't see. Neither of them would talk about the rules, and when I tried, they would suddenly find urgent, vital work on the other side of the ship. On the third day we cast off and the Seattle skyline dissolved behind us into a gray, featureless smear. The thrum of the engines was a steady artificial heartbeat beneath my feet, a rhythm that seemed to be syncing with my own pulse. I stood at the stern watching the last of the land disappear, a profound sense of isolation washing over me. First time on a cargo ship? James's voice was quiet beside me. First time on any ship, I admitted. You've been at this long? Feels like forever, he said, his gaze fixed on our churning wake. He was silent for a long, heavy moment before asking, You read the captain's rules? Yeah, they're weird. James nodded slowly, his eyes finally meeting mine with a flicker of sincerity. Just follow them, Marcus. Okay? Don't get clever or test them or look for loopholes, just do what they say. What happens if you don't? I asked. He looked at me then, and I saw a raw, naked emotion that stunned me. It wasn't just tiredness in his eyes, it was an old, deep, settled fear, voice cracking, nothing good at all. That night I made my first mistake, a small moment of casual carelessness while cleaning up after dinner. I watched the sunset bleed across the water in spectacular strokes of orange and violet and dumped the old wet coffee grounds over the side. The rule said not to throw anything overboard between sunset and sunrise, but the sun was still a burning sliver on the horizon. It was setting, not set. I was being clever and went to bed feeling like I'd found a loophole. Morning watch was at 5:30 a.m. and when I stumbled onto the deck my blood ran cold then turned to ice. The coffee grounds were back, not just scattered but arranged, spelled out in wet dark glistening letters across the white painted steel, You're next. The ceramic mug slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the deck, the hot coffee spreading like fresh blood mingling with the ominous words. Problem, Rivera? Harrison's voice was calm and sharp as a shard of ice. I spun around, my heart a frantic panic drum against my ribs. The grounds, I threw them out last night and they're back. Harrison looked at the message then at me, his face unreadable, and he nodded with profound disappointment. Rule 1. Between sunset and sunrise. What part of the word between did you fail to understand? But the sun was still up, I argued. Sunset to sunrise, he repeated patiently, not dark to light. The rule is precise and the sea doesn't care about your interpretations. It has its own schedule. I looked back at the message, at the two words that felt like a death sentence carved into the very skin of the ship. How is this possible? I asked. You're asking the wrong question, Harrison said, kneeling beside the words with an almost academic interest. You should be asking why it came back as a warning instead of something worse. He looked up at me, his eyes like chips of ice. Clean this up, all of it, he commanded, towering over me. And Rivera, follow the rules exactly as written. There are no loopholes on this ship. I spent the next hour on my hands and knees scrubbing the deck with a frantic energy born of pure terror, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the brush. The grounds came up easily, dissolving into nothing under the bristles as if they were never really there, but the bitter acrid smell of coffee lingered in the air, the smell of my first terrifying lesson. David found me as I was finishing and wordlessly handed me a fresh steaming mug of coffee. First rule violation, he asked in a low conspiratorial voice. How did you know? I asked. We've all been there, he said, looking around the empty gray deck before leaning closer. The ship is a fast teacher and usually it only has to teach you once. What is this place? I whispered. David's soul-tired eyes met mine. Just follow the rules, Marcus, and don't ask questions you don't want the answers to. 2 days later in the dead of night, in the heart of a suffocating fog, I found out why. I was on night watch and the fog was a living thing, so thick it felt like I was breathing water, muffling all sound and reducing the world to a few feet of ghostly gray deck. It was a featureless maze as I checked the cargo containers, my flashlight beam a lonely pathetic spear in the oppressive gloom. It was 3:15 a.m. when I heard my mother's voice. Marcus, Mijo, help me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking up, my blood turning to sludge in my veins and weak, and it came from the water, from the black churning void just beyond the rail. It was her voice, the one that sang me to sleep as a child. Please, Marcus, I'm so scared. Rule 3 was to ignore any voice you recognized calling your name from the water, but this was my dying mother. Marcus, please. I can't swim much longer, her voice was filled with a desperate gurgling panic. I broke into a run, my boots slapping against the wet sticky deck, and reached the starboard rail with my flashlight beam cutting into the roiling fog. The water below was black as ink, a churning hungry void, but I could hear her splashing and gasping for air, her pleas growing weaker. Every instinct screamed at me to dive in and save her, but the rule was an absolute commandment. I gripped the cold wet steel rail until my knuckles were white and my teeth clenched so hard I thought they would crack. I closed my eyes as tears streamed down my face and listened as my mother's voice slowly faded, swallowed by the fog and the uncaring monstrous sea. When morning came, the fog had lifted and I went back to the same spot, drawn by a morbid curiosity. On the rail where I had stood there were wet handprints, small and delicate like a child's, and they were fresh. James found me staring at them, my mind a maelstrom of grief and terror. Rule 3, he asked quietly. I could only nod, my throat too tight to speak. Good man, he said, placing a heavy comforting hand on my shoulder. What if it was really her? I asked. It wasn't, he cut me off, his voice firm and absolute. Trust me, hermano. Whatever is out there, whatever your mother. The sun eventually burned the prints away, but they were seared into my memory, a ghostly touch I would feel for the rest of my life. That evening, a sharp insistent, it was Harrison, his face a grim unreadable mask in the dim corridor light. My cabin, Rivera. Now. His cabin felt smaller at night, more claustrophobic, and the charts on the walls seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight like veins on a living skin. He poured 2 glasses of a dark viscous liquid from a bottle with no label, the liquid moving sluggishly like old oil. You're learning, he said with a note of grudging approval. Good. The ship needs crew who can follow instructions. Why do you say it like that? I asked, my voice hoarse. The ship needs? Harrison steadied me over the rim of his glass, his eyes glaring.